Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about what fundamentally makes an American story different than any other kind of story. And if you've seen the title for this video, you probably know the answer to that question. The answer to that question is because Americans do not believe that the government has a monopoly on violence. And I'm going to argue that that is the fundamental core of an American story, even if it's never even touched on. And I'm interested in exploring such ideas. Number one, because I like to talk and think about the political, having studied through political science, political theory, the origin of ideas, but also because I'm a writer. And not just a writer, but a writer who goes back to the ancient definition of a story, which is at the same time a logical argument and a reflection of reality. And as such, in order to become a better writer, I want to trace the origin, the principles of an American story. And of course, those principles are expressed in reality. And what more, to discuss those realities according to the traditional, logical, reality-based concept of what a hero is. And by the way, if you're looking for those kinds of stories, traditional kinds of stories with traditional heroes based upon the old ways of making great stories, I have 2 links in the description and the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels. 2 of them are superhero graphic novels, one a return to form for low fantasy. You're looking at some of the beautiful art for those graphic novels in the background. Each of them focuses on a heart of a traditional hero. And I will, at the end of this video, play a trailer for one of those graphic novels so that you can see a little bit more of the art and a little bit of the story. So if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description or the pinned comment and go on over and see if one of my graphic novels is for you. But back to the topic. So I'm going to discuss this in terms of storytelling, and this is for all storytelling, I would say. However, I'm going to focus on comic book storytelling because, again, that's what I have the most information on. That's what I write. That's what I've covered over the last 6 years of this channel. But to be sure, it applies to any other form of storytelling as well. And in order to get to my thesis of this entire thing, I'm going to start from a seemingly absurd place. And that is to ask the question, if you see on the internet a piece of art that is generated by AI, can you recognize it? If you, for example, see thumbnails generated by artificial intelligence, because, oh, by the way, YouTube now has this new feature where you can get an AI to generate a thumbnail for your video. If you have creators which are doing that, can you immediately recognize that piece of art as an AI-generated piece of art? I would say most people would say yes. And why can you do that? Well, you can do that because as human beings, we are creatures that focus on pattern recognition. And although it may be unconscious, you can recognize in this unconscious way a pattern that exists there which tells you that it is a piece of artificially intelligence-generated art. Now, I would argue this can be done for human art as well, especially if there's something wrong with it. So let's take another example. I would assert that it is very easy to pick out people who want to be manga artists who aren't actually from Japan or Korea or China, basically the Far East. Why? Because artists, especially younger artists, don't quite understand that they have an instinctual bias as how to draw things, especially the human form and the human face. And the farther east you go, the more you get into peoples who have very distinct facial features as separate from European and thus North American facial features. So the question is, why do these wannabe manga artists who are not Far Eastern Asians draw faces and proportions in a way that makes it look like it's not manga? Well, it's because they have been surrounded all of their lives with a pattern of facial features that are European or from some other part of the world. Whereas, on the contrary, people from, say, Japan have been surrounded their entire life with people who have the same facial features as them and as they're trying to portray within manga, and they just instinctually draw things that way. Now, yes, there is certainly skill added to the entire thing, but the point is, there is an unconscious, instinctual understanding of how these patterns play out and what their natural form is. And again, it's my assertion that you can take the exact same statement that I just made and apply it to other forms of art as well, certainly the art of storytelling. So let's look at how this plays out on the ground, as it were, for just a second. Much of the problem with current day storytelling, and when I say that, I mean for the last, 20 years or so, is that it's become so ingrained with political ideas, current political ideas, that if you are in any way outside of the sphere of influence of those ideas, and that can be outside of the sphere via location or via time, the story will no longer make any sense. On the opposite side of that spectrum is the idea that writers can tap into such universal appeal that they can write a story for anyone, of any place, of any time, and they become what we call timeless stories. It's because they're appealing to something fundamentally human that exists within every human being, regardless of space, time, education, etc., etc. However, we can't make a hasty generalization and say these are the only two forms of storytelling that you're going to get. There are certainly forms of storytelling that are in between these two, some closer to one side than the other, and one of those in-between kinds of storytelling is a kind of storytelling that appeals to the fundamental understanding of how people think in a specific region of the world. And this is what traditionally good American stories do. And the thing that they tap into, that understanding, unspoken understanding, instinctual understanding that they tap into, is at its heart the idea that the government does not have a monopoly on violence. Now, quickly, to put it in logical terms, if we look at a story as an argument, which traditionally, for thousands of years, it has been expressed in that way, a good story is a good logical argument. What kind of logical argument is it? It's a rhetorical argument. And what is the earmark of a rhetorical argument? Well, it is to start from a basis not of first principles, but of argumentation that your audience will automatically accept. And so the rhetorical argument for an American story, that basis that you don't have to explain, that your audience automatically accepts, is the idea, once again, that the government does not have a monopoly on violence. Now, for a second, let's look at the other arm of what a story traditionally is seen as. It's seen as a reflection of reality. And so it would be that this American idea is also at its basis a reflection of reality. Because although it is a rhetorical argument, it's a rhetorical argument that does have a connection to principled ideas. It's just not expressed in every story because it doesn't need to be expressed. And those fundamental ideas are expressed in the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution and the American experiment is based upon an idea of natural law. Natural law itself drawing its own argumentation of why it is true from principal arguments of reality. And one of those principal arguments is, of course, that you have not just the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but the unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that a fundamental part of you as a human being is that you have a right, which no one can take away from you, to be free. And it flows from that fundamental right that if someone does try to take that freedom away from you, tries to take that liberty away from you, you have also the right to defend yourself in order to secure your liberty. And that does indeed mean, yes, that if the government wishes to take away your liberty or tries to take away your liberty, you have the right to defend yourself, which is to say, the government does not have a monopoly on violence. All right, so let's look at this from a different angle. Let's look at it from the angle of everyone else in the world who aren't American. Now, we'll start here, and I have to start here, and I usually do within my videos, start here and say to Americans that you are in a unique position in the entire world. No other large government in the entire world believes that its citizens have unalienable rights. And the fact that I have to actually come out and say that over and over again drives home the very thing that I was saying a few minutes ago. It's the idea that unalienable rights are so instinctually, fundamentally ingrained in the American mind, in the American psyche, in the American individual, that they don't even realize that the rest of the world does not operate the way that America does. And although the rest of the world, or parts of the rest of the world, do recognize that their citizens have rights, they simply do not recognize those rights as unalienable. That is to say, they do not recognize that you have those rights by virtue of being a human being. No, their governments argue from a point of authority saying, no, we granted you these rights and therefore we can take these rights away from you. They do not belong to you. They have been loaned to you through the power of the government. And as such, in those kinds of societies, the government, yes indeed, does have a monopoly on violence. Because, once again, even fundamental rights, like the right to life and liberty, is not yours by virtue of being a human being. It is yours by the buy or leave of the government. And the government can take those things away from you because it has a monopoly on violence. And so the government is therefore set up in a way where it has a monopoly on violence. Now let's look at this according to story and how it plays out throughout, well, recent history. Some of these are more objectively verifiable than others. But if you look at the historical writings of both communist Russia, which was the Soviet Union, and National Socialist Germany, you will see that both of those ideologies express a disdain for America according to what? According to their storytelling. Both of them basically said America is doomed to failure. Why? Because these people idolize criminals. Now, in saying that, they weren't entirely wrong. They were looking at both the story of Westerns and the stories of gangsters, and they're saying these people idolize criminals. Therefore, they're morally bankrupt. Therefore, this country is not going to last very long. And why did they make that assumption? Well, they made that assumption because they didn't understand the very fundamental idea of America that the government does not have a monopoly on violence. And while of those two kinds of stories that I just talked about, one expresses it in a positive way, one in a negative way, they both express that exact same idea. Because that is the idea of the Western. That is the idea of the Old West. You have a guy, he has a gun strapped to his hip, and if someone gets in his way, he has every right to defend himself. And personally, I would say all of these gangster stories had a fundamental message that was the same. They just brought that point to its extreme, wherein the story would show you, where do you cross the line? And the stories would say, these gangsters, they have crossed the line. They exercise violence not in a defense of rights, but in an attempt to take rights away from others. But these are quintessential American stories. And they are quintessential American stories because they have that idea about violence at their core. Now, to go farther out on a limb, I would say this is most probably also the reason why you have French and Italian people who are very invested in, let's say, old Western stories, even to this day. So much so that it seems they're more invested at this day in American Western stories than Americans are right now. Why? Well, in my estimation, it's because those are two very Catholic countries. And the thing is that the only major institution, world-altering institution that exists right now that believes in unalienable rights besides the United States is the Catholic Church. And so these two countries have people which have a streak in them, nowhere near as large a streak as Americans have, but a streak in them of the idea that they have fundamentally unalienable rights. Now, I would say that it is almost completely drowned out by the deluge of secular ideas that says, no, your rights are granted to you by the government. Therefore, we can take them away. Therefore, we have a monopoly on violence. But there's still a streak in, I think, French people and Italian people that harkens back to that idea of the Old West because it harkens back to a religious belief that is fostered within them that, yeah, you have unalienable rights. And yes, that means, therefore, you have the right to defend yourself, which, again, is expressed in the fact that you have a right to use violence. Also, by the way, this is why I think that if, as an American, you look at French and Italian Old Western stories, they look familiar, they look right, but they also look slightly skewed. They also look like there's something not quite right there. Why? Because as an American, you're recognizing that basic idea that they crave, which is we have unalienable rights to defend ourselves, but at the same time, they are still French and Italians, and they're still, for the most part, covered with this idea that rights aren't actually, in reality, granted that way. And so it produces a sort of hybrid that looks sort of right, but just quite isn't. And if you want to draw the line of where that is, look at the difference between traditional American Westerns and a spaghetti Western. You can see that they're different. You might not be able to put your finger exactly on why, but you can see they're different. And to take another tack on this entire thing, this is exactly what I think you see within, especially Japanese pop culture. To some extent, they have an almost reverence for America, and they have, for decades upon decades, tried to reprint, as it were, repackage American ideas and express them in a Japanese way through story, which produces sometimes funny, sometimes good, sometimes absurd, sometimes grotesque versions of American stories. And why? Well, it's because they're looking at America and the American way of doing things, and they're saying, I can reproduce that, but they don't understand the fundamentals behind why and how those stories exist. And once again, it all comes back to rights, unalienable rights. And a story that I've told a number of times on this channel, if you look at the end of the First World War and the creation of the League of Nations, which is the precursor to the United Nations, when all of the countries got together and they said, okay, we're going to build this international organization that is concerned with law, we're going to have to find out what is the most basic thing we all agree on as the basis of law itself. And they said, oh, we know, let's base it on rights. All of us have some kind of understanding of rights as the basis of our law. And, metaphorically speaking, China and Japan raised their hands and said, no, we have zero tradition, legal or otherwise, based on the idea of rights. It is a foreign concept to us. We cannot, therefore, make it the basis of the League of Nations. And all the rest of the countries promptly ignored them and said, yeah, rights it is. So for Far Eastern cultures, the idea of rights, not just unalienable rights, but rights in any form, was completely foreign to them until it was imposed upon them a little over 100 years ago. And so these societies of the Far East are collectivist societies. They have very little understanding of rights as a historical tradition. They have no backing of the concept of unalienable rights, and therefore they fundamentally do not understand the idea that you can have something else than the government which has a monopoly on violence. And if you want a more direct example of this, look at the anime, especially the anime movies that Japan produced in the 80s, trying to reflect the hyper-masculine, hyper-violent action movies of America at that time. They became almost absurd caricatures of what they were trying to portray. Why? Because the idea at the heart of those stories was indeed violence, and Americans think about violence in a fundamentally different way than really anybody else in the world, certainly as a country. And since the Japanese had no real tradition of not only those ideas, but the limits of those ideas, then the limits, which again are unconsciously put into even American hyper-violent 80s movies, wasn't even considered when they were reproduced in a form that was Japanese. Now, I wanted to go down that line of thinking specifically because you have a lot of people right now, especially younger people, who are very, very attracted to Far Eastern storytelling, to things like manga. And I would say part of the reason why some of these young people are attracted to these kinds of stories is because they are collectivist stories. Now, yes, I admit some of it is because they simply tell a good story, a story that's not, as far as we can see from North America or Europe, run through with political ideas, but I'll get into that in just a minute. But more to the point is, there has begun to be a streak within American society, a deliberately placed there streak within American society that degrades the idea of unalienable rights. And I've talked about this a number of times. This is objectively provable, certainly looking at the types of justices, not just on the Supreme Court, but on lower courts as well, that were appointed by specifically Democratic governments. They were appointed because they didn't believe the truth of unalienable rights, and they wanted to switch the government towards a more European model. But because you have this streak of ideas within American society now, and for the last couple of decades, you have people who are more attracted to this collectivist way of thinking, and who are indeed, to some extent, repulsed by the idea, the American idea, that is at the heart of its stories, that yes, you, as an individual, in protection of your own rights, can indeed employ violence. Employ it, that is to say, in a just way. If you want a pop culture reference to this that you might be familiar with, there was a guy, I'm sure he's probably still making videos, but I haven't listened to any of them in a long time. It's probably been about 5 years. On YouTube, his name is, I think, Black Pigeon. Anyways, he talks, or used to talk anyways, a lot about the collapse of Western society and how basically he thought that Eastern cultures, like Japan, were going to eventually take over as the controlling power of the globe. And his estimation was he looks forward to the time of Oriental dominance over the West. Why? Because, well, if I remember correctly, he lives in Canada. He thinks he understands American ideas, but he really doesn't, because Canadians don't have an idea of fundamental unalienable rights. And so he's looking at the same thing in America as those historical writers from the Soviet Union or the National Socialist Party were looking at America and saying, well, look at all this violence. Look at how they crave violence. Look at how they glorify violence. Obviously, they're not going to last. Obviously, it's going to fall. And for them, the historical writers, in their mind, obviously a more European model would take over, a model of granted rights by the government, whereas he, as a YouTuber, was looking at a more collectivist version was going to take over, that of the Far East. And why? Once again, why? Because he doesn't go back to first principles. He repeated his own rhetorical arguments so much that he no longer thinks that the assumed arguments of being correct that he starts from are anything else than principled arguments, which they're not. And just as a quick aside, I stopped listening to his channel because they were absurd arguments at that point. And also absurd arguments that I had heard over and over again, because those are the kinds of arguments we heard in the mid-'80s about Japan taking over the world. And absurd arguments because most people, in North America certainly, don't understand how collectivist Eastern societies work, how much they're based upon ethnic lines, very harshly divided geological lines, like the fact that they have an island nation, or in South Korea, a nation on a peninsula with a lot of mountains to the north. These kinds of collectivist societies can only flourish in very specific conditions, and they don't see that. But anyway, my point in going down that line of thinking is the fact that if you look at the entertainment around you today, certainly within the comic book industry, but all forms of entertainment, you will see that the reason why it is faltering, the reason why American entertainment is dying, is because they have tried to extract themselves from this fundamental principled idea, this ingrained, habitual, instinctual idea at the back of every American mind that the government does not have a monopoly on violence. And yes, they do indeed, as individuals, have the right to employ violence on their own behalf to justly defend their own rights. Now, it may seem like I'm cherry-picking that out of the air, but let me give you the exact example of this from the comic industry, which, if you listen to my channel, you may already be familiar with. But in 2009, the person who ran Marvel Comics, and the rest of the comic industry just does what Marvel Comics does because it's the big boy on the block. But the head of Marvel Comics at that time, who was Joe Quesada, went to a unknown, unexperienced woman who was Sana Amanat, who, by the way, had political and family connections to international organizations and international thinkers, and said to her, we want you to come and we will hire you at Marvel Comics. We will fast track you so that you become the person in operational control of Marvel Comics, and we want you to fundamentally change the way that not only American comics are made, but American comic stories are made. And this, by the way, is a story she herself relays. And she said, I don't have the experience to do that. She had only worked at a small indie company for 2 years doing, we don't even know what. There is no record of what she did before that company went bust, certainly went bust in America, and I think moved its entire operation to India. That's all the experience that she had, besides her connections. She said, I don't have the experience to do any of that. And Joe Quesada looked back at her and said, that's exactly what we want. Why? Because they wanted to fundamentally change how the stories were made. They wanted to start from scratch and tell stories in a completely different way. And that completely different way includes taking out the basis of what makes an American story an American story. And what is the evidence of that? Well, after being in that position for about 10 years, where she became the person second in command in operational control of Marvel Comics, the vice president of character and story development, that was her actual title. She was the one who directed how stories developed. She did an interview with an older Marvel writer, a great Marvel writer from the 1980s, who is Ann Nesenti. And Ann Nesenti said to her at that time, the thing about American comics is it always comes down to a fight. And she realized that after being in the Marvel bullpen for a very short time. She realized it was a boys' club, that the stories came down to a fight eventually. That's what the high point was. And so she had to train herself in order to think more in that direction. And how did she do so? Well, she took classes, boxing classes, where she would learn how to give a punch and take a punch, and she would understand not just this violence, not just this conflict, but the fight itself. And Sana Amanat replied to her, well, that's the way comics used to be, verbally patting her on the head and saying, but that's not how comics are anymore. And she went on to say, as director of content, that the way stories are constructed, comic stories are constructed in the current day, is according to ideas like how to be a good friend. And she admitted that yes, they still had to have that conflict in there. She did that in this interview and others, having quotes like, we have the kicking of the butts down, but now you have to concentrate on, can you be a good friend? That's what the characters and the story need to revolve around. And this shows the primary disconnect that current stories produced in America have from American society itself. Not only are they saying, well, we have to make it for an international audience. It has to appeal internationally to people. Therefore, we can't base it on American ideas. And they say that because they don't believe there are fundamental ideas that are at the heart of all human beings. They are part of these political groups that want to get rid of the idea of unalienable rights and go to a more European model where they say that's just a mythological origin story. Your rights are actually granted by the government. Therefore, they can take them away. Therefore, yes, they have a monopoly on violence. And really what Sana Amanat was saying and what she is referring to is that they have conflict, but they don't have a fight. And the two are different. Why? Because what Ann Nesenti was describing was a personal thing. Again, she had to understand these personally. She had to learn how to, in her own words, take a punch and give a punch. How to defend herself. It wasn't an amorphous idea of conflict in some way. It was a very personal defending of yourself through violence. Whereas Sana Amanat was saying, yeah, there's still some conflict in there, but it's this amorphous idea of conflict. And once again, the divide between those two mindsets is the idea of who has the right to use violence. And we can see this kind of mindset play itself out within even different comic companies. You had Tom Taylor writing Superboy in 2022. This newer character, John Kent, was supposed to be the replacement for Clark Kent as Superman and was being groomed as such. And as Tom Taylor was writing a series for Superboy, he said the following: we somehow managed to keep people engaged without actually having John punch anyone for 6 issues. I think that's really important as well. And he went on to say, so we have a young bi guy who also is just the sweetest, most empathetic, nurturing guy who doesn't want to hurt anyone. And I think that's far more heroic than someone punching a supervillain in the face. Tom Taylor is, by the way, Australian. So he himself, I would say, doesn't understand how to write a truly American story or a truly American hero like Superman. And why? Well, it's clear and plain to see. Because he doesn't actually want him punching anyone. He's more concerned with modern day politics and how this character can be empathetic. Yeah, I'm sure that those kinds of storylines where your character has empathy, where they can be a good friend, does have some place. But if you're using those to subvert one of the primary reasons this character exists, one of the primary reasons why Superman stories are American stories, then no, you don't know what you're doing. And this is exactly the point of why these new kinds of entertainment and writing are failing, especially for American audiences. And despite what all these people want to claim, it is American audiences that drive the success of an American story. And by the way, all of this is the answer to the question of why are American comics so focused on superheroes? Why? When people look at, let's say again, Japanese manga, they see all of these different kinds of stories. But Americans and American comics are almost solely focused on superheroes. Why? Well, it's focused on superheroes today. If you look in previous iterations, going back through pulp stories, magazine stories, you'll see there is a similar strain in all of these kinds of American stories. There's crime stories. There's Western stories. There's war stories. There's barbarian sword and sorcery. All of these kinds of stories focus on that specific American idea, and they only really make sense when you accept that idea. or at the least accept the possibility of that idea. It is the idea, once again, that the government does not have a monopoly on violence. That's why these superheroes exist. They are vigilantes. Why? Because they can justly employ violence. And you can easily sell that to an American psyche. American comics focus so much on superheroes because in this seemingly unending concrete jungle that we live in right now, it is the only place left where you can have this type of character, this type of vigilante who expresses that primal American idea. And once again, primal, just American idea. And finally, I get down to the point where I want to discuss this entire thing briefly as it relates to a traditional idea of a hero, that idea that has run through Western civilization for more than 3,000 years. The traditional hero in Western culture is a person who is a paragon of virtue, and the employing of those virtues in your life does indeed require a fight. It not only requires personal sacrifice, but it requires that sacrifice in one of its forms is that you must fight. You as an individual. Not you must take part in a conflict. No. You as an individual. Your will, your choices, your habits, they are all a form of violence over a baser nature that wants to bend you towards vice. And for my own way of thinking, it is quite the reverse of what those old European voices kept on saying about the destruction, the inevitable destruction of America and the American idea. For myself, I would say those European ideas, those old ideas that rights are granted to you by the government, those are the ideas that have a limited number of days left in their lives. It is the American idea, the idea based in reality, that as a human being, a fundamental part of you is the right to liberty. That idea still has not gotten to its apex. That idea will continue to grow over the centuries because it is the future of our civilization to recognize not just that idea, but to breed heroes of men through that kind of thinking. Because, as I said, it is that habitual, instinctual, unconscious acceptance of this idea that yes, you justly have the right to employ violence in defense of your own liberty that feeds into a truly heroic person, a person who is willing to make sacrifices and fight without and within to subjugate in a violent way the baser, vicious nature of mankind. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there are 2 links in the description for my 3 graphic novels, 2 superhero graphic novels, and 1 return to form for low fantasy. And I will be playing a short trailer for one of those graphic novels in just a moment after I finish speaking. But if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description or the pinned comment and go on over and see if one of my graphic novels is for you. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.
No matter how many wars you fight, no matter how much blood you shed, no matter how much rage you loose, no matter how many demons you face, no matter how many companions you lose, no matter if our kingdom falls, I know that you will return to me in honor.